Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Good morning to whoever is in DC. Welcome to our event today. My name is Yasmin. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Middle East Center. It's my pleasure today to be joining you as both a speaker and a moderator for today's discussion, which is on climate change and regional integration in the Maghreb. Generally, the topic we're approaching is that although the countries in the Maghreb scored low emission points, North Africa more generally is considered to be one of the highest threatened regions by droughts, water level rises, and environmental catastrophes. Today, the region already faces some of these challenges, which pose significant threats to socioeconomic stability. And generally, while these challenges demand regional cooperation, there has been a long-standing fragmentation amongst Maghreb countries that has hindered cooperation, leaving states to address climate risks through either national policies or by seeking external partnerships. So in today's panel, we're going to take on these issues, unpack some of them together, and it's my pleasure to be doing this today with esteemed colleague Fred Wary, who's a senior research fellow working on governance, conflict, and security in Libya, North Africa, and the Persian Gulf at the Carnegie Middle East program in DC, and Joy Arke, who's a research assistant who works on climate change across North Africa, who's also based in DC in the Middle East program. She's going to be joining us shortly. So we'll just start the discussion, and then whenever Joy joins in, she'll let us know. We're going to discuss three cases across the Maghreb. So we'll look at Libya, Tunisia, and Morocco, and the challenges and paths forward. I'd like us to maybe start the discussion by providing some context around our respective countries, the patterns that we see emerge when it comes to environmental vulnerabilities, their implications for socioeconomic stability, and importantly, how have national and local actors responded so far. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Fred Wary to discuss the case of Libya.
Great, thank you so much, Yasmin, and it's a pleasure to join you for this conversation, building on your own excellent recent paper on Morocco's peripheries and climate vulnerabilities. And I think this concept of peripheries really applies to Libya. I've visited Libya twice in the context of climate-related research. And I was really struck by the country's, severe vulnerability to climate change. Very briefly, just to run through some figures. Obviously, Libya is a desert country. It's afflicted by soaring temperatures, declining rainfall, rising sea levels, and extended droughts. In terms of the leading measures or metrics of climate vulnerability, Libya is up there, right? It's just after Iraq in terms of being among the most vulnerable countries in the world. Much of its vulnerability has to do with diminishing availability of water resources. 80% of Libya's water is drawn from non-replenishable aquifers. There's also the problem of Libya's intense dependence on hydrocarbons, as is well known, that has created a bloated, public sector. What's interesting is that Libya is, despite its very small population, around 7 million people, it is one of the highest polluters in terms of carbon emission per capita carbon emission. And this has to do with its incredibly wasteful oil producing processes, and also the dependence of electrical generation on oil production, what's called flaring. And Libya's agricultural sector is severely threatened by climate change. It comprises really only 2% of the GDP, but what's interesting is 20% of the population earn their livelihood from the agricultural sector. So just to raise some themes that I think will inform our discussion, is there are vulnerable populations in Libya that are tied to specific geographies, and the ones that I looked at are the western Jebel Nafusa, the Nafusa Mountains, that has a heavy percentage of people who earn their livelihood from agriculture. There's also an ethno-linguistic dimension to this, and that this is where the majority of the country's Amazigh, non-Arab Amazigh minority live. The southern Fazan population or region, which is a vast desert region to the south, and the Jabal Akhdar in the Green Mountains in the east, which was the site of the horrific Darna flood tragedy in 2023. And just to raise some themes here in terms of how these regions are grappling with climate vulnerability, the key issue is a disconnect between these far-flung regions and the very fragmented, disunited government. So the government, to its credit, and Libya's government, of course, is split between East and West. But in the last year, according to some officials and consultants I talked to, there has been progress in terms of developing strategies, developing plans. Libya is one of the few countries in the world that has not submitted a nationally determined contribution, which is its climate plan for mitigation and adaptation. It is making progress in developing that plan. There are plans for water management. There's plans for biodiversity. There are some positive steps in terms of developing a municipal level coordination strategy. But the key thing I want to emphasize is the lack of capacity, right, to implement those things. And so the key theme is that the local level governments, the heads of towns in these various regions, civil society actors, local farmers, they're on their own, right? And so they are the ones that are having to undertake climate adaptation strategies through water rationing, through countering the encroachment of the desert. They're struggling with, obviously, the problem of water resources. Many people are abandoning their farms, moving to the city. And so the key theme that I heard throughout my interviews was that the government needs to build a bridge between its own national action strategies and these local level actors in terms of empowering them, right? Giving them the budgetary authority, giving them the resources. This is an incredibly difficult thing to do in a place like Libya, where decentralization has always been a problem ever since the 2011 revolution. And just to raise the issue of regional cooperation, this is a key thing for Libya. Libya needs outside assistance, right? It is receiving outside assistance from the Europeans, from the United Nations, and until recently from the U.S. Agency for International Development, which was doing very important local level work in terms of helping communities build climate resilience. Tragically, that work has now stopped, and its impact is going to be felt in Libya. The Europeans, of course, are shifting their priorities away from development toward defense. So I think this is going to be felt acutely in a place like Libya, and it just speaks to the need for the theme of this discussion that the Maghreb countries themselves need to get together and form a better regional cooperation strategy on climate adaptations. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Fred. I feel like you've really outlined the heart of today's session. I think a lot of keywords that I hope we can expand on later on today have been mentioned, and especially on the last point, I'd like us to come back to that at the end of our discussion, and specifically thinking about external actors and impacts of decisions made elsewhere for the region. Joy, welcome to the panel. And maybe we can move on to Tunisia, if you don't mind. So we were just kind of outlining the context of our areas, the patterns that we see emerge when it comes to environmental vulnerability, socioeconomic stabilities, and what are national and local actors doing so far.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me today. Apologies for the technical issues. But I will get into Tunisia. So to begin with, Tunisia is severely exposed to droughts that have been caused by rising temperatures and reduced rainfalls that has depleted the country's water reserves, which is problematic, of course, because 70% of water is used for irrigation in Tunisia. and this has led to deteriorating food insecurity and water quality, especially amongst farmers and livestock breeders in the interior and northwest regions. And of course, water quality issues have made low income communities more vulnerable to waterborne diseases. Women, of course, there are trends of women facing an added layer of vulnerability as they deal with water supplies and hygiene in the household, and they deal with their husbands leaving to migrate from rural areas to urban areas to seek employment due to food shortages and lack of economic opportunity. And aside from the rural sector, urban infrastructures are also experiencing increased instances of flooding, which are in the northern and eastern coastline, specifically major economic and tourist hubs. And lastly, I think it's necessary to highlight Tunisia's hyperdependence on natural gas, especially imports from Algeria, which heightens its vulnerability and exposure to energy price shocks, especially lower income households, once again, are the most vulnerable and are not shielded from these fluctuations. And of course, this complicates Tunisia's efforts to achieve affordable clean energy and reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of adaptation responses at the national level, the government is increasing meteorological and climate monitoring and primarily focusing on extreme events, which can cause significant crop damage. So at least there is, a level of attention to the vulnerable communities in the agricultural sector. They're also prioritizing water efficiency in the agricultural sector and deploying desalination plants to improve access to water quality in water scarce regions. And in the energy sector, they have set a target for achieving 30% renewable energy production by 2030 through hydro and solar power projects, as well as introducing energy subsidy reforms to reduce their dependency on fossil fuels. So there are steps being taken in the right direction. But of course, localization and involvement of local actors is the different story. As Fred was alluding to on Libya, decentralization, there's still a lot of work to be done on that front, although there is some level of involvement with local and civil society actors filling in the technical gaps at the national level. There's the example of the Tunisian Water Observatory. It's a civil society organization. It's a good success story to point to, but it's a project that basically allows citizens to report water shutoffs and poor water quality. And in 2022, this was really useful when there was extreme water shutoffs. People were referring to the organization as a model for centralizing data, but there still remains regulatory and financial obstacles for the most part in involving local stakeholders.
Excellent, thank you. I think you've localization in particular again here is really, really important, and it's going to come through in my next question. I'd like to maybe just build on your insight to present a kind of perspective from Morocco's eastern region, which is the case that I've looked at myself, and I think here maybe to tease out some of the similarities, the continuities and changes that we see across the Maghreb. I mean, in the case that I look at in particular, the major climate-related threat is insufficient and irregular precipitation, which results in water scarcity and have a significant impact specifically on the agricultural sector. I think here it's important to look at the significance of the agricultural sector for the Moroccan economy, which represents approximately 15% of GDP, 20% of its export, and is responsible for huge amounts of rural employment and jobs overall in the country. I think in the case of the eastern region, which is region in the east of Morocco, water scarcity here has exacerbated the situation of locals that are already suffering from border securitization. And so if anything, climate change to some extent kind of acts as a magnifier for already existing and pre-existing socioeconomic challenges here. And in this context in particular, it would be unemployment, what you both have mentioned in terms of peripheries and marginalization. And so I think here, again, there are some similarities to think about, and particularly to think about localization, the roles of municipalities, of civil society, in integrating further regions that tend to be seen or described as peripheral. However, I think there are still maybe some differences, particularly when it comes to how have different actors responded locally. And so at the level of the Eastern region in particular, and I don't know if this is, I think in Tunisia it was implemented, I'm not sure about Libya, but there have been cooperatives, and particularly this kind of rise of the cooperative sector since 2016. Again, I think it's important to kind of mention that cooperatives as a solution to climate change and the agricultural sector has been more of a recent thing. Again, here specifically in the case of the Eastern region, where it really stemmed from mitigating the impacts of the border closure and specifically on socioeconomic livelihoods. And these have been accompanied by various mechanisms, so raising awareness, financing, encouraging entrepreneurships, and so on. So I think this is kind of at the local, regional level, which maybe presents, again, here a case study to look at in terms of this border climate nexus. At the national level, and probably quite similarly to what you guys have mentioned, there are several macro level plans, if you want, both specifically in the adaptation, mitigation kind of side of things. I mean, yeah, as some of you might know, Morocco has specifically been, quite, I would say, proactive in dealing with climate change, in promoting sustainable development across different sectors, and through engaging with the international process, so ratification of various conventions and protocols, and then nationally, and specifically since 2010, to kind of coming up with its own strategy for climate change. Whether that's at the COP, whether that's when it comes to nationally determined contribution, which I guess is quite different to the case of Libya, as you mentioned, Fred. But then again, there are still other plans, so in the National Climate Plan, National Adaptation Plan, and various sector-specific strategies here. I think, so these, to some extent, I mean, provide the roadmap for coordination and for developing a climate-sensitive policy. But I think the real impact of climate change in the past couple of years have really been not just in the agricultural sector or felt nationally in a kind of macro scale, but they have started to kind of have a domino effect across society at large, and particularly when it comes to water cuts, access to water, and so on, that we've seen in the last summers, which I think has prompted maybe more concrete plan, a growing sense of urgency, focus on the adaptation side of things. And again, these include specific initiatives, whether we think about tackling shortage of water, constructing dams, desalination plants, various types of initiatives that seek to encourage farmers to switch from heavily water-reliant crops onto to others which require less irrigation. And so we kind of see this two-way level, which I think speaks to the broader themes that you've brought up on decentralization, localizations, and the challenges that come with those. I'd like us to maybe delve slightly into that a little bit more, and to create more thorough discussion between these respective case studies, specifically on what can a locally rooted climate governance model look like, and to maybe expand a little bit on these existing tensions between the state level, the macro level, which tend to be rather centralized across North Africa and the Middle East, probably more broadly, and their local ramification and dimension, which is oftentimes the side that is most marginalized, and that tends to feel also the effects of climate change a lot more deeply, particularly in rural areas and peripheries. Fred, perhaps, I mean, we could think about Libya's, climate vulnerabilities, and what you mentioned as political fragmentation. And I'd like to know maybe, in your view, what kind of mechanisms, whether formal or informal, could help bridge these divides and integrate peripheral regions into a more cohesive climate adaptation strategy. You've mentioned some of this before, but I'd just like us to maybe go slightly deeper on this subject.
Yeah, so again, I think, at a sort of very, very technical level, there are some positive steps in Libya where the different municipalities are going to meet later this year, actually in May, and there's going to be sort of a coordination where they harmonize, this was the word that was used, harmonize their various requirements, their various practices, and they convey that, they bundle that, and that allows the cities and towns to access external adaptation funds, because you can't do that individually as different towns. So the fact that they are meeting and coordinating allows them to get more assistance from the outside and hopefully share, best practices. So this is an encouraging step in the right direction. I think it doesn't completely solve the problem in Libya of empowering municipal actors to act as agents of climate adaptation rather than simply providing services. And this is what the way it was described to me is that, sort of providing water, providing this, but what I heard from these town councils is they want more empowerment in terms of the budget, the political authority. Why hasn't that happened? Again, it goes back to your point about climate change amplifying pre-existing political tensions and grievances and fissures in these societies. Much of this has to do with Libya's history as an authoritarian state, and that, as a dictatorship, there were intense, splits between the center, between the regime and various peripheries, various regions, and there were opposition movements, there were ethno-linguistic grievances. So, for example, the Amazigh minority in the Nafusa Mountains, they have long complained that their villages have not had access to the Great Man-Made River, which is the famous water infrastructure. And so why is that? It's political, right? And so I think that has improved recently. But we find this repeatedly elsewhere in Libya. As is well known, the reason why the Storm Daniel had such a devastating and tragic effect on the city of Derna in terms of its lack of preparedness was because Derna was a hub of opposition and Islamist opposition to the ruling warlord in the east, General Khalifa Haftar, and Derna was not empowered to prepare for such climate events, right? And so we find this repeatedly elsewhere. And I think this really speaks, and I'll close here, it speaks to the need for a broader political reconciliation, for inclusive governance. And as you mentioned, that climate change should not be securitized, right? And I think in many regimes, there's a sense that climate activism can be threatening to those in power, right? Because you could move from simply demanding things like better water access and these sorts of things. You could very easily move from that into challenging the existing structures of autocratic government in these countries.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the case on municipalities actually links very nicely to Joy's paper with Sarah Yarkis on Tunisia and the role of municipalities and civil society. And again, coming up with a more locally rooted climate governance. So, Joy, what is your take on this, and especially if we were to consider sectors like water, agriculture? What is your take on ways in which we could have national policies that are better supportive and empowering local actors, whether, again, municipality or civil society, or else?
Thank you, Yasmin and Fred. On the role of municipalities in achieving climate adaptation. Unfortunately, Tunisia, I mean, there have been steps towards involving them in decarbonization plans and streamlining national plans towards municipalities. The intention is there, but this hasn't been translated into an actual workable legislative framework. And going back to what Fred was saying, financial constraints play a huge role as well in stifling their involvement, because Tunisia seems to always be prioritizing larger monopoly state-owned energy companies, as well as deals with the EU that take into needs. These companies seize fertile agricultural lands that end up disproportionately harming local farmers that rely on these water supplies, for instance. And in terms of, dismantling this top-down structure, there needs to be more access to finances, and I think a reversal of economic policies that prioritize export revenue over involving local communities. Tunisia's policies are very much driven by revenues at the state level, and this can be seen in the agricultural sector, for instance. The policies are centered around, for example, cultivating and exporting vegetables and citrus, which bring in revenue but are water-intensive crops that deplete local reserves. And in the agricultural sector as well, there is a monopoly structure. In 2024, the government actually created a national fodder office that granted the state a monopoly over fodder production and importation. And because the government has been controlling pricing to make it cheap for consumers, this has raised the cost of production for farmers and worsened food insecurity. And the same dismissal of vulnerable communities' livelihood in policymaking is also seen in the energy sector, where Tunisia's energy subsidy reforms, for instance, like I said, have failed to shield lower income households from energy price increases. And in terms of involving municipalities more in the governance model, obviously transferring power to community-owned projects and civil society organizations and accessing financial opportunities is necessary. There is coordination among civil society towards climate issues, but they're not sufficiently integrated at the national level. In the agricultural sector, civil society workers have talked about having little funding for training and workshops on advanced technology and data analysis, for instance, which has left them ill-equipped to respond to climate impacts on agriculture. And this is one of the many opportunities for policymaking where investing in technical capacity can bolster Tunisia's resilience, especially since CSOs traditionally possess more technical knowledge than officials.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's really interesting. I think the perspective would kind of integrate in more broadly local communities who might have, kind of deeper knowledge or maybe a greater sensitivity towards the environmental challenges that they themselves face is also, it's something that I've also tried to look at it in the paper. And I think maybe, relative to both of your discussion, especially on this point, is that I wanted to kind of add a caveat and specifically to maybe say that it's communities, generally have developed some ways of dealing with issues like water scarcities through centuries. And they have developed some, especially when we think about ancestral knowledges, and thinking about how, in the case study that I looked at in particular, inhabitants of Figig, for example, have historically relied on date cultivation. And so they've been equipped with centuries-old underground irrigation system, which are known as khataras, that the community was through which the community was able to channel underground water to the surface and to distribute it later on through a network of canals and basins that would collect it. And so in some way, I think adding the kind of point that although when we look at current strategies, local communities tend to be to not be necessarily included or empowered in these plans. They have still themselves developed strategies which I think could very much inform the national adaptation and mitigations plans, and should be very much part and parcel of that, rather than just moving on with something very different. I'd like to maybe just add kind of some context about the Moroccan point, which I think relates a lot to what both of you have said, and specifically on Fred, also what you mentioned on that, this is a kind of continuity and a historical continuity. And so I think for me, especially when I started looking at this region, a realization that I had was that it is really important to situate it in this kind of broader historical, political, and economic reality. And we're generally looking at regions that have been marginalized, that have been shaped both by geographical distance from the centers and reinforced by various political processes. So whether that is securitization, whether that is fragmentation, and so how then these factors very much end up dictating the nature of climate adaptation efforts, both in terms of what is feasible and in terms of what is allowed or what will maintain stability in the long run. What I find interesting is that there is a lot of tensions here between the kind of top-down process and the bottom-up, and that they're both. I think there's still a lot of issues in finding the right balance across the region, but looking at the case of the Eastern region, I find it quite interesting how we actually find both, and how there is a kind of dual dynamic that is very much exposing these, these tensions and the difficulties of completing this huge task. We have on the one hand, a model again that is quite familiar, a model that is very centralized, major decisions that are made at the national macro level, large-scale structural projects. So whether we think about dams, whether we think about desalination plans, which end up being the main key pillars of the climate strategy. And these projects, I think, are necessary, right? And particularly even when it comes to peripheral regions, because they do provide to some extent infrastructures that has been lacking historically. But the issue starts coming up when they don't necessarily take into account the local realities. And as you said, Joy, specifically of people that have been experiencing this and who are familiar with it and sensitive to it, and who perhaps have lived it even more, right? I think I've looked at different examples, but this does tend to have significant impact on the most vulnerable communities. At the local level, and again, I'll just speak for the specific region that I've worked on, is the kinds of, again, mechanisms that we can find. And so to some extent, thinking about third ways, right, or solutions that were provided historically as third ways, such as the cooperative system. I think cooperatives are really interesting because on the one hand, they strengthen farmers' leverage. They do give them more ownership over their resources, over decision making, and so can provide a platform for locally driven response to climate pressures. But at the same time, we still come back to the question of agency and thinking about how much agency do these communities actually have in shaping climate policy, in that these existing frameworks do actually promote some level of inclusion. They do promote some level of participation, but they are still very much kind of constrained by limitations that have existed for a very long time. So whether we think about bureaucratic constraints, limited access to decision-making platforms, limited financial capacities, and logistical support, like you mentioned, Joy. And oftentimes, yes, these do tend to impact vulnerable sections of the population a lot more, which are not necessarily seen as co-creators of policy here. I would like to maybe think in the case of Morocco, there have been significant, discussions over decentralization, over whether it is possible and feasible to give more scope to local and regional authorities, especially in this kind of regard, and having a greater representation for peripheral region. So I'd like maybe to know what is the process in Tunisia and Libya, and whether, I think you both have touched on this specifically on decentralization, whether this is something that, could provide a kind of long-term solution into integrating local communities and so on in climate responses.
Joy, did you want to go?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, thank you, Yasmin. In terms of decentralization, offering long-term solutions, I think in Tunisia's case, it is very much possible, and there are budding signs of this. Like I was saying earlier, there's still the monopolization of interest groups, but as you were saying as well, the infrastructure and the bureaucracy that we've been dealing with for years has also provided, to an extent, agency to local stakeholders, and we can't deny that. One example of progress I can talk about with Tunisia is in its energy sector. It passed a law in 2015 that that basically promotes investments in locally led independent renewable energy projects. I mean, for the most part, these communities are still underrepresented because of lack of financing, but there's at least that discussion at the national level, whether that will be streamlined into municipal policy action. There will have to be coordination, legislation that requires coordination amongst ministries, which, I mean, through my analysis of the entire region, this is very much lacking at the ministerial level. There are, ministries and specialized offices that exist, but very much in a siloed manner. And there isn't an exchange and a centralization of data and communication for when there is a violation of some type of a climate standard at the national level and local level. And I mean, I also think it's important to talk about the need to involve the private sector in accessing and diversifying financial streams and empowering local communities. In Tunisia's case, they very much could benefit from involving local banks in developing adaptation plans and funding small, medium-sized enterprises. The structure is definitely lacking in Tunisia. In the water sector, there were pushes to privatize, but this was quickly thwarted by a dominant labor union group, which is unfortunate because privatization could, of course, studies have shown could improve operational efficiency and lower costs for the water sector and other sectors, climate-sensitive sectors. So in general, I think legally backing public-private partnerships and having a structure for that is a pathway for, of course, alleviating the country's public budget, reducing reliance on international aid, and empowering stakeholders.
Thank you. This is actually, fascinating. Thank you. Fred, did you want to say something to that?
Well, a lot of the same issues that Joy raised exist in Libya, in the sense that there is a ministry of municipal governance, but it's basically ineffectual, and so there's a real gap between the top level institution and local actors in terms of, again, access to funding, administrative authority. People pointed out to me an outdated law that prevents municipalities from engaging directly with foreign suppliers, foreign companies, and so there's a lot of this is legislative, financial, but it's also political. And I do want to point out that the problem also in the eastern part of the country is that municipal level governance has become militarized. I mean, it's basically under the thumb of the ruling figure there, General Khalifa, Haftar, and so that certainly limits the maneuverability of local actors. And I do think the problem of including the rural, population in climate adaptation in a place like Libya is that the, national authorities are quite dismissive of the agricultural sector because it contributes such a minuscule amount to the GDP. And so there's no real sense of alarm that, farmers are having to abandon their farms and crops are failing. And according to some, scientists that I talked to and agricultural specialists, I mean, this is an obvious failing because it increases Libya's food insecurity, right? The fact that it has to import all of its foodstuffs. So this is very short-sighted, but it stems from the issue that, Libya is a hydrocarbon dependent, country. The other issue that I'll raise in the context of Libya, and I think this is unique to Libya relative to Morocco and Tunisia, is the lawlessness of Libya and the fact that you have these very predatory, militias and militia bosses that are profiting from a very predatory approach to natural resources, whether it's fuel and oil smuggling. I mean, but also the natural degradation, right? So there's been massive deforestation in Libya that in part has been undertaken by criminal networks and militias who are chopping down the trees to convert that into charcoal and, building very profitable structures, apartment blocks, are on top of land that was previously protected, right? And so this has to do with the utter lack of rule of law in Libya. And so all of this is intertwined, and so it's simply to say that Libya is, I think, going to be facing a severe crisis, in the future. And again, just to close, the problem that I think Libya faces is one of priorities in the sense that people, external actors, Libyan elites are so focused on solving the political crisis right now, and what was called the tyranny of the immediate, right? That Libya has this pressing need for stability, for peace, to unify the institutions, that it doesn't have the bandwidth to tackle these climate-related challenges. But as I've hopefully outlined, they're all interlinked.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, on I think on the priority of solving political crises, there is maybe a kind of third angle that we could look at, specifically since the topic is also on the challenge of regional cooperation, and perhaps to think here about how the position of climate change when it comes to regional cooperation, whether this is a priority or not in light of other ongoing fragmentations and tensions across the region. And generally, when we think, in conversations at least about climate adaptation, and specifically here in border regions, which is what I've looked at before, international organizations often emphasize the need for, cross-border cooperation. And this makes sense because, generally when we have bordering communities or even just within a region that is fairly similar, even if they are divided by international boundaries, these communities often share similar cultural, linguistic, economic ties. So we can think about it in terms of ethnic groups, in terms of cross-border populations, or generally even as states, but they also face similar environmental vulnerabilities, which means that perhaps the challenges and even the solutions to them are inherently connected. So perhaps I'd like us to maybe zoom out here from our individual cases, and we've highlighted how a lot of the socioeconomic and climate issues are interconnected, and to maybe think about them from a regional perspective. So, what would be your kind of take for genuine regional cooperation in the Maghreb today, and specifically on climate adaptation? Would you say that this is even possible? I don't know if you would like me to go first, or if you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay. I mean, I think from my perspective, again, here focusing on the Moroccan case, it seems that regional coordination, yeah, I think remains largely absent. And I guess, I mean, this is probably no surprise to anybody who works on the Maghreb or North Africa more generally, that this is a political fragmentation that's been very well documented historically. That's been a challenge to various levels of cooperation through different time periods. In the case of the Eastern region specifically, and these same tensions have kind of, seeped into it and probably shaped a lot of the current position of the region, where we have more recently, I mean, fully closed borders, minimal diplomatic engagement, limited regional integration, and so on. And so this kind of political reality spills over as well onto climate adaptation, where and I'd like to think about it in some way as a kind of a border climate nexus and what the implications of that are for border communities in particular. In this case, in the shared resource that would have eventually made sense to create collaboration around would have been the Bounaim Tafna water basin, which is a transboundary aquifer between Morocco and Algeria. And in theory, I mean, this could have been a natural area for cooperation. But in practice, the absence of coordination has led to several issues and limitations over extraction, contamination, and of course, no formal agreements on both sides. I think the case of this of the Bounaim Tafna basin in particular is not necessarily unique to water governance, and I think it extends to broader climate adaptation policies. So again, yeah, at the moment it probably remains quite low, quite absent. It doesn't look the same way as in other regions. So perhaps in West Africa, for example, where there has been some efforts towards creating collaboration around cross-border environmental governance and so on. But at the same time, I think climate change does not respect borders, and it also is a long-term challenge. And so in the coming years, worsening droughts, rising temperatures, increasing water stress and scarcity, I think there could potentially be some level of coordination. Although this might not be institutionalized, I think maybe we can remain slightly open-minded about the prospects, for this. But of course, it is hugely dependent on the political tensions and fragmentations that have existed for a long time. And I think there is also the reality that, as you mentioned, I don't think that this is necessarily a priority for Maghreb governance, and specifically in the context of existing tensions. I think there are much bigger issues that are being dealt with that don't necessarily, evolve around transboundary water collaboration or other forms of collaborations on this topic. But again, it is a long-term challenge. So yeah.
Yeah, so just to echo what you very eloquently outlined, I mean, I think Libya is a real case study of this fragmentation and sort of the country. I mean, it's isolated. I mean, this has to do with its conflicted nature and this fact that it's seen as sort of a catalyst for instability, terrorism, smuggling. And so the borders of the country have been hardened. I mean, they've been securitized. The border with the Tunisian-Libyan border has been famously securitized, and that's impacted the ability of communities on both sides to engage in trade and commerce that they've carried on for, centuries. And so the Algerian border has been closed, and I spoke to Tuareg communities in the south of Libya who are impacted by that. Aside from the physical hardening of borders, I think there is the problem you pointed out of broader diplomatic and political tensions affecting climate cooperation. And my own personal experience, having tried to organize some climate workshops in the Maghreb, in Morocco, and the Libyan participants never got their visas, right? So this is an ongoing problem of distrust of Libya, the political tensions. Encouragingly, however, I was just told last week that the Moroccan government did host a delegation of Libyan meteorologists to go to Morocco for, training. And Morocco, as you know, is a leader in weather monitoring and meteorology. So this was an encouraging sign. But I think this sort of training and exchanges is happening at a very ad hoc, level. There was another Libyan climate official who was invited to a regional workshop, I believe, in Lebanon on climate adaptation. And again, his visa didn't come through. So these are longstanding problems. But as you mentioned, I mean, there is a realization that climate-related events, do not respect boundaries. And so these countries have a lot to learn in terms of managing things like sandstorms, early warning of floods, these sorts of things.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Joy, would you like to add anything on this?
Yeah, sure. As you were both alluding to, of course, you can't discount the political fragmentation in the region, and the fact that climate adaptation is probably not a priority. But there is something to be said about integration, strengthening regional stability, and positioning North Africa as having the upper hand as an energy supplier to Europe, since it's something they all have in common. And I have noted cooperation between Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. They already have interconnected electricity networks, for example, and at the end of the day, this helps them all individually achieve their decarbonization goals. But of course, it is worth questioning if emphasizing on the regional scope, especially as you were saying, Asman, if this is not institutionalized or formalized, will this come at the expense of, again, local empowerment and over-reliance on X country, especially in Tunisia's case, relying on Algeria for gas imports, and as well as water security. Actually, recently, the Tunisian minister had a visit to Algeria, and water security was at the top of his agenda because the Maghreb River in Tunisia is its main water course, and is sourced from Algeria. And so there is, I think to an extent it is a priority, but of course more through the lens of security and political stability than it is for the greater good of achieving like sustainability. But I definitely think that these are avenues for cooperation, as long as, when there are these larger agreements at the regional level, it trickles down to discussing benefits towards local stakeholders as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like us to maybe just take on the last few minutes that we have to think about. You mentioned, Joe, just now the priority is mostly on security and stability, and I'd like us to maybe take that lens into other actors as well, and thinking about what outside actors can do beyond the region. So whether we think about African states, whether we think about the European states, whether we think Gulf states, and so on, and like what are the prospects you think for regional cooperation at that level, and perhaps here, what does it mean for what we've discussed so far on localization, on integrating local communities, and as you rightfully mentioned just now, on how the kind of macro level types of integration and agreements do trickle down to local communities, or should. If you don't mind, I can go in first as well, or because I think there has been an interesting case here that kind of ties in these points together in the Eastern region again, and to kind of, which was presented as as a way of maybe doing things slightly differently. And so at the level of the Eastern region, there have been initiatives for cross-border collaboration mostly here again through the model of the cooperatives and plans for sustainable development for this region. So far these efforts have taken two forms. On the one hand, kind of keeping the conversation going, engaging officials, especially elected officials, to shape policy agendas for climate adaptation, and creating local partnerships. So a case that I've mentioned there was done through a Belgian NGO that has facilitated bilateral cooperation on local development between the eastern region in Morocco and the Kaolack region in Senegal, both of them, being in kind of similar positions geographically. And so both of them ended up being pilot projects for territorial coaching, which is seen as a way of, strengthening links between elected officers, providing sector-specific training, and in this case, it was specifically based on agricultural production, which did provide, a level of, bottom-up, localized cooperation that can offer a potential for scaling up. And I think here, it was interesting to see that this very much kind of follows a broader, direction of Morocco towards the South-South cooperation with the rest of the African continent. And again, with the specific case of the Eastern region and external partners, the EU is, of course, a critical player on this level, both in terms of supporting projects, providing finance, and there have been several efforts, especially towards, shaping and providing training to cooperatives, strengthening their capacity building, and so on. And I think next to that, there are also the broader partnerships and strategies with at the kind of national level. So again, thinking here about the Green Deal, about IMF and World Bank financing, different plans, for example, on green hydrogen and so on. So there have been, I think this has opened up space for external actors to come in, but I think there still remains kind of key questions on the localization, on the inclusion of local communities, on what role should external institutions also play in the just transition and so on.
I'll just speak very briefly about where Libya is headed with outside assistance and the need for more regional and local ownership. Again, over the last year, there has been some significant developments with outside actors providing help for Libya's national strategy. So the UNDP has been helping Libya with a national water scarcity plan. The GIZ, the German Development Agency, has been helping it with a national adaptation plan. The list goes on, but the theme that I hear is that, given the current global environment, there's going to be a constriction of that outside assistance, in part because of shifts under the U.S. administration, which is going to trickle down to the UN. So again, just to re-emphasize that I think it's really the time now for local governments themselves to step up and help one another. And I think there is also a role for the Gulf states as well. A lot of Libyan actors have talked about the UAE's role and importance in terms of the climate technology and various assistance that they can provide. So.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not sure if we'll have time, but I would perhaps, if we're lucky, we can come back to the point on US assistance, because this is a really important one. Joy, would you like to say anything maybe about the case of Tunisia?
Yeah, actually, to bridge the point of U.S. assistance, the recent USAID cuts in Tunisia largely did include economic support for vulnerable children affected by climate, and specifically wheat purchases for food security. So there definitely is merit to engaging in external partnerships for needed investments and adaptation plans. But something, I think is also important to highlight and pretty interesting is to what extent does this disrupt the current division of powers and institutional setups locally, because at least in Tunisia's case, this is already very overcrowded. there are private sector developers, for example, that have reported difficulties in understanding their roles and in terms of the procedures for rolling out projects, given the considerable number of ministries and public institutions that are involved in renewable energy projects. So at least in terms of renewable energy, I wonder if, expanding involvement internationally will cause for further fragmentation locally. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really important point, as you mentioned. I mean, whether to think about it in terms of the Maghreb region, or also, I mean, internally from within, in terms of like having a cohesive and integrated approach to these issues. I'm not sure if we have any questions from the audience, but we are just out of time, actually. So, I'm not sure if there's. Let me just check. All right. Okay. No questions. If not, then is there anything that you'd like to share as a final thoughts, or anything that we haven't touched on that you feel important, or? All right. Okay. Well, it looks like we've had a rich discussion covering really many topics, so whether local communities and climate governance, their role, the challenges of water scarcity, regional cooperation, the role of external actors, and whether this can lead to further fragmentation. Thank you both. Thank you so much, Joy. Thank you so much, Fred, for your time, for your expertise, and for your insights. Thank you to the audience as well who have joined us. And thank you. I hope we get to discuss these soon. And have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you, Fred.